I'm mic'd. I don't need this one, right? That's okay. I'll take two. But as I said, I have a very loud voice, so might not need a lot of it. Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to come. What Diana didn't say was that she was one of my first graduate students. So it is wonderful to see a student. I think we've been friends now for quite a while, but I think she graduated close to 10 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago. And so it's just such a pleasure to see students in the classroom and the graduate students, and then to come out and become professors in their own right. And it's just really wonderful. So I'm so pleased to be here and pleased to be on campus. Like Diana said, I teach at Sac State, so I see many Cosumnes River College students in my classes later on, and I'm just thrilled that these discussions about gender and women or reproduction are continuing across universities, from community colleges to universities and other colleges. So what I thought I would do today is begin with a definition of what reproductive justice is, give you a general history, because I am a historian, so I always have to go far back. But I won't go that far back today, I promise. And then give you a couple of examples of how it plays out. So has anyone heard the term reproductive justice? A couple? Yeah. You've heard the term reproductive rights, right? And if I say reproductive rights, what do you think about? Yeah, that's exactly it. So abortion becomes kind of defined as reproductive rights. And one of the things that's happened consequently is that the larger movement for reproductive justice has gotten lost, okay? So part of this is the way that it was tracked. It was emerged in the earliest forms in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And it was not covered very much by the popular media. It was overshadowed by efforts to legalize abortion and then to preserve the right to legal abortion as an anti-abortion movement rose up. Reproductive justice, though, was a much broader movement. The other thing that's kind of happened, and I'm going to kind of talk about this throughout my portion today, is that there's a process of remembering that's not just at the moment, but that's written by historians who we choose to write about, what stories are in the archives, what stories we choose to tell. And increasingly, the story of reproductive justice has been told. The earliest scholars of women's reproductive health focused very much on abortion, to the exclusion of reproductive justice. And largely what that meant is that women of color have gotten left out of the story of reproductive justice and of women's efforts to establish rights to reproductive health. So reproductive justice, very broadly, has three tenets. The first is that women, and you can argue men as well, have the right to bear children. They have the right to have children when they want them and under conditions that they want them. Number two, they have the right not to have children. That means they can use contraception, they should have wide access to it, and that if they have the right to abortion, they can choose to exercise that right without fear. The third tenet is the one that oftentimes gets pushed to the side, but I think is deeply important, and that's women who have children should be able to raise their children with dignity. That means they should have access to good public housing, or to good housing, to quality education, to neighborhoods that have access to transportation, to food, to health care, right? Increasingly, the reproductive justice movement as of 2 years ago has linked up with Black Lives Matter. The idea that when you send your son out of the house, he comes back home again, right? And that's not a privilege that shouldn't just be for people who have white skin, but that should be for all mothers and all fathers. So reproductive justice is all-encompassing. Reproductive justice comes from, and the earliest movements come from, this woman named Johnny Tillman. Johnny Tillman was the leader of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The National Welfare Rights Organization was established in the mid-1960s. Johnny Tillman was a woman from Los Angeles who received public assistance. And what she was noticing in the early 1960s is that welfare had expanded because of the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 said everybody should have access, regardless of race, to public programs. You can't discriminate based on race. Because for a long time, welfare was, although it was coded, everybody could have it. When the states administered it, they prohibited women of color from getting access. The Civil Rights Act said everybody has access to it. And all of a sudden that everybody had access to it, we start to hear these kind of racial epithets, the concept of a welfare queen. Have you heard that term? The idea that there's a woman who, and she's almost always labeled black and poor, who has children so she can get money from the government. She doesn't want to work. There's no basis to it. It's a myth entirely. But the backlash is such. In terms of Hispanic women, we start to see the term called pregnant pilgrim, which is like a precursor to anchor babies. Have you heard that term? Women crossing the Mexican border to bear children in the United States who have access to welfare. Didn't happen. Totally a myth. But it's a response to the opening up of federal programs to women of color. Tillman challenged this. She says, my reproduction and my reproductive labor, so that of raising my children, is as valuable as the white woman next door to me, right? She's the person who actually pioneered the concept of reproductive choice. You've heard that choice. It's the pro-choice and the pro-life movement right now. That's kind of what we've heard since 1973. Well, the hidden history is that she was the one who came up with it. Women should have reproductive choice, and she articulated it in a reproductive justice perspective. Women should have the choice whether to bear children or not to bear children, but those who do bear children should be able to do so in dignity. Okay? So Johnny Tillman, and part of what I want to do here is kind of bring forward people who have been left out of history and link reproductive justice to larger social movements, because at its core, reproductive justice is about intersectionality. It's about understanding how different types of oppressions come together, right? And how people work within a variety of movements to create social change. So I want to make sure I bring her up. Now, the person who actually coined the term reproductive justice is Loreta Ross. And I'd met her about a year ago, and I was so tongue-tied that I just sat there smiling like an idiot because I'd been teaching her work for so long, and I was having breakfast with someone at a reproductive justice conference, and she just like sat down and started eating oatmeal. And I was like, oh, I don't know what to say to you. I just bumbled through it. It was terribly embarrassing. But she's still fabulous. I was just so tongue-tied. So Loreta Ross is the person who actually coined the term reproductive justice in 1994, and with that she launched an organization called Sister Song that was about the reproductive justice movement. Now, she's someone for whom reproductive justice was tied up with her racial, socioeconomic, and gender identity. When she was a child, she was sexually assaulted twice. Once at age 11, once at age 14, and at age 14 she was raped by a much older cousin who was 27, and she became pregnant. Abortion was illegal at the time. Her parents talked about taking her across the border to Mexico and decided it would be too dangerous. So she had the baby. She ended up continuing to go to school, although she had been accepted at Harvard, but Harvard made no exceptions in the late 1960s for unwed mothers, and so she was not able to go to Harvard. She ends up going to Howard University in Washington, D.C., and she eventually gets her degree. One of the things that happens, though, is while she's in Washington, D.C., she has a Dalkin shield inserted. Has anyone heard of a Dalkin shield? I don't know why I'm picking this up as if I'm going to draw one for you. It's an IUD, and it's also not that big. It's an IUD that was used in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And while most IUDs are safe, the Dalkin shield most definitely was not. It was an IUD that had prongs facing downward, like literally imagine a shape, and then it had like fish hooks, and then it came in. And the idea was that it wouldn't slip out of a woman's uterus. What ended up happening was that it bedded in uteruses. It ended up killing over a dozen women and maiming hundreds of thousands. So young women who had this were rendered sterile as a consequence. The other problem is it had this wicking issue. So it's very quickly taken off the market. But Loreta Ross is one of the people who helps to get it off the market because she has an IUD inserted and she has an infection as a consequence of this Dalkin shield. And she goes to her doctor and she says, I don't feel well. I have a temperature, I have pelvic pain, I have all these things. And he looks at her and he goes, well, you're poor and you're black, you must just have an STD. And that's what he said. So the infection persisted for several months. She came back, they realized that this was a massive infection, and they ended up having to remove all of her reproductive organs, meaning in her late 20s, she was rendered sterile. She could never have another child. She sues A.H. Robbins, which was one of the companies, which was the company that manufactured the Dalkin shield. She was successful, and a series of other lawsuits came forward, and they together bankrupt the company. So, here's one woman who has a tremendous amount of power, right? Because she stood up for herself. But one of the things that she notices is after this, she's working at the grassroots level, and she's invited by the National Organization of Women, or NOW, to come and work with them. And in particular, they want her to do outreach to communities of color. And she says, look, the National Organization of Women is kind of a white, middle-class women's group. It's become very much a pro-choice group, where they're focusing just on issues of maintaining women's access to abortion. And she says, look, you're missing these other issues. I don't really care that much about the right to abortion because I can't get pregnant. I care about issues of contraceptive safety. I care about issues of sterilization. I care about the ways in which doctors are treating me. I was treated differently because I was poor and I was black, and this infection could have been taken care of with antibiotics. Instead, it led to this massive surgery and the end of my fertility. And the doctor really didn't care. So she's thinking about it in this broad way, and she does start to work with the National Organization of Women, and she actually is quite successful in turning their internal culture, which had some elements of racism in it, and changing that. But after 5 years of working with them, she quits because she finds that although she's able to make inroads into communities of color, increasingly what the National Organization of Women is doing is saying to communities of color and women of color, this is our agenda, please get on board, rather than, hi, this is our agenda, what's your agenda? How can we work together? What are some of the issues that interest you? How can we advocate for you? And that wasn't happening. So she leaves and she ends up finding Sister Song. And that's where we have this movement for reproductive justice. And she's linking with civil rights groups, with Chicano and Chicana rights groups. And this is all through the 1990s. So this is kind of past the big rights movements of the 60s and 70s. But she launches this huge movement, okay? Because of reproductive justice, scholars like me have had this new framework from which to use to examine the larger histories of women's reproductive health care. So for me, what I study is sterilization abuse, and that's one thing. I also study voluntary sterilization, and I put the two together in my first book, but I want to look at forced sterilization. How many of you guys have heard about this? A few? Yeah? Okay. Have you seen the faces of the victims? I think it's important to see who they are. This is now Ruth Cox. In November of 1964, she is just 18. She gives birth to a child out of wedlock. And I'll give you her words because I think her words are very powerful. She says, I was living with my mother and 8 sisters and brothers. My family was on welfare, but payments had stopped for me because I was 18. We had no hot or cold running water, only pumped water, no stove, no refrigerator, no electric lights. I got pregnant when I was 17. I didn't know anything about birth control or abortion. When the welfare caseworker found out I was pregnant, she told my mother that if we wanted to keep getting welfare, I'd have to have my tubes tied, temporarily. Nobody explained anything to me before the operation. Later on, after the operation, I saw the doctor and I asked him if I could have another baby. He said that I had nothing to worry about, that of course I could have more kids. I know now that I was sterilized because I was from a welfare family. She lives in rural North Carolina, and part of her story, and I'll just go back to her picture for a sec, part of her story is part of this larger history. In fact, her story is this larger history of sterilization. Sterilization had been a eugenic procedure until the like the 1940s. North Carolina jumps on the eugenic bandwagon after World War II, and it says, look, if we are arguing that certain people are unfit to bear children, that the state can sterilize them because they lack this reproductive fitness, well, all of these women on welfare, who are increasingly black women, because this is North Carolina in the segregated South, well, we think the fact that they're poor and they're black indicates that they're unfit to have children. So therefore, we're going to sterilize them as a form of population control, but also we're going to sterilize them as a form of leveling out our budget, because it costs a lot of money to provide this. There's a huge amount of racism behind that. Don't think that there's not. All the other eugenic sterilizations in the country are going down. North Carolina skyrockets up. And this happens not just in North Carolina, but in the South as well. So Mississippi, starting in the 1950s and early 1960s, experiences a rash of what were called Mississippi appendectomies. A woman goes into a hospital to have some kind of abdominal surgery, a cesarean section. In the case of Fannie Lou Hamer, the famous civil rights activist, to have a uterine tumor removed. Without their knowledge, their informed consent, their uterus is taken out during surgery. Notably, this happens in areas where there's lots of civil rights activism. We see a push of it after Brown v. Board of Education ends segregation. It's a way that white doctors were essentially saying to black women, you think you have power now? We have power. This is what's going to happen if you continue to step out of line. And this can also happen, I'll just point out that this is before the age of consent forms. Now when you go to the doctor, even to do, just to get a basic flu shot, you have to sign like 5 pieces of paper, right? I fully understand everything that's going on. None of that existed here at all. So there's this rash of sterilizations, and it's starting in the South. And by the time we get to the 60s, it's slowing down in the South, but it's starting to spread to other places in the country. I'm going to come back to the slide in a second. We're starting to see it in New York City. This is Dr. Helen Tria. She's a Puerto Rican immigrant. She's a physician, and she's one of the people who speaks out against sterilization abuse in the 1960s and 1970s because she notices that with mass immigration from Puerto Rico to New York City, increasingly the rates of sterilization among Puerto Rican immigrants are going up, 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 up. We see in California, in a case called Madrigal v. Equiligan, that Chicanas in particular who go to USC LA County Hospital are going in while in labor, so going in to have children. While in labor, their doctors are saying, you really should have your tubes tied. Can you sign a consent form if you're in labor? Should you be able to? No, it's a little distracting. Having had 2 children, it's kind of distracting. You can't really focus on the consent. If you've had medication, are you fit to sign a consent form? Do you know what's going on? No. Increasingly, Mexican American women are going into the hospital. Doctors are assuming because of their ethnicity and because they're poor, although I will point out that in this lawsuit not a single one was on welfare, that they have too many children and it's doctors' social responsibility to stop it. There were doctors at UCLA hospital or USC hospital that had buttons, like everyone liked those little political buttons back in the day, and they said stop at 2, as in stop at 2 children. So a woman would go in to have her baby, and the doctor would be increasingly saying, well, you're getting ready to deliver, sign the form. No, I won't. Sorry, not had, best of luck. I'm not delivering your baby. And women would be coerced into it. Now, what's remarkable is that women are standing up. This is a lawsuit, it was a class action lawsuit filed by 10 Chicanas, none of whom were on welfare. Dolores Madrigal is the lead plaintiff. This is Gloria Molina and Madrigal again. This is a lawsuit. Antonia Hernandez is a first year. She's just gotten her law degree. She's working in Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. Someone comes to her and says this is happening. She does a series of interviews and finds out that this is a real problem, that women are going to USC LA County Hospital, and if they're poor and if they're Mexican American, they're leaving without their fallopian tubes. There's also the problem here of an issue of language. Doctors are saying you can have your tubes tied, or sign here, no big deal. Well, if someone tells you you can have your tubes tied, it kind of assumes that they're going to be untied, right? Especially if you're not a non-native speaker. What happens if you're being told in English you need to have all of these things done? You're at the peak of labor, right? You're ready to have that baby, and you have no idea what is actually being told because no translator has been provided to you. None of that had to happen. Consent forms didn't have to be in patient's language of origin. Consent forms did not, the process by which consent was obtained did not have to have any kind of interpreters. So these women sue, and they lose, sadly. When the judge ruled in this case, he essentially said, while I respect and I'm sorry for what happened to these women, it's not the doctor's fault that these women did not understand English. Best of luck to you all. And they lose. This sparks a movement, though, and this is where reproductive justice, although it's not termed yet, gets into action. We have coalitions of different groups of women of color coming together. This is in California, this is actually San Francisco, to stop forced sterilizations. And there are clear movements to do so. I want to point something out, too. I'm going to go back to the Trias. So she's demanding sterilization regulations. As a physician, she's involved in the New York City coalition already. She knows what it's going to look like. And what they want to do, one of the efforts to stop forced sterilization, is to set space between the time of consent and when surgery happens. So to give, for example, a 72-hour waiting period. You consent, at one point you have to wait 72 hours to have your surgery, because then you can't be coerced into it, say, at the peak of labor. Does that make sense? She's demanding this. She's demanding an age minimum of 21. But here, she puts everything together. Abortion is every woman's right, and forced sterilization as well. She sees these as together. She's not separating them. But when the New York City Health and Hospital Corporation, then later New York City, and then eventually New York State, because it takes the lead in this, comes together and sets up sterilization restrictions, they find that there are a lot of white women's groups, especially Planned Parenthood and NOW, who are not happy about this. And while they say we don't support forced sterilization, we can't support restrictions on sterilization either. They're deeply concerned that if there are restrictions placed on sterilization, then restrictions will also be placed on abortion, and Roe v. Wade will be overturned. Can you see where that's going? So what ends up happening is that you have, instead of this kind of one general group of women's rights, in order to stop forced sterilization, women, for example, who want to have voluntary sterilization on demand, and this was an issue. Voluntary sterilization becomes legal. Planned Parenthood has a plan to have voluntary sterilization clinics set up across the country, which means you walk in, you say, I want to be sterilized, you walk out 3 hours later, you've been sterilized. Well, if there are 72-hour waiting periods placed on sterilization, it makes it much harder, right, for women to go in and say, hey, I'm ready for my sterilization. Instead, they have to go in, sign forms, and come back 3 days later. So now when Planned Parenthood say, look, we are against forced sterilization, but we also don't want, one, our business plan interrupted, and two, we're concerned that if you put restrictions on sterilization, you can do the same on abortion, and it's going to prohibit women from getting the surgery. Does that make sense? Can you see where it's going? So you have these kind of conflicts. Notably, as the movement starts going, this is California. California passes the most broad sterilization restrictions in the country. It has a 48-hour waiting period. It has age 21 minimums. It has a series of very clear consent forms and restrictions on those issues to make sure that patients are able to give proper consent, and all of the information about the surgery is available in their native language. And one of the things they do because of that magical lawsuit is they understand that that these restrictions shouldn't be applied just to public pay patients. They shouldn't be just applied to individuals who receive welfare, because there are a lot of poor women who are being sterilized who are not on welfare. So they have them for everybody. In 1978, the federal government adopts guidelines through the Department of, it's going to become Health and Human Services, and they say to California, you need to bring yours in line. They had reduced the time period, they had brought the age period minimum down from 21 to 18, and they said these are public pay patients only. And California said, well, we would like broader restrictions, and the federal government said, no, you have to narrow your restrictions to be in compliance. So California kind of led the way and then brought it back. It's notable here too that if you look at the pictures, these are all women of color, right? What we don't see here is true interracial cooperation. Now, there are a couple of groups, in fact, there's the New York chapter of NOW, that's predominantly a white group that gets behind sterilization restrictions. And they essentially say, look, if the choice is between me getting a sterilization or abortion on demand and you not having your fallopian tubes, I can wait a few days. That's not a big deal. But that's not where the majority of activists go. So as we see movements to end sterilization, and we see them all the time, this is reproductive justice, you see faces of women of color. You're not seeing white women. This is not a collective movement. Does that make sense? It would be nice to say that all women came together to protect the most vulnerable women's reproductive rights, but that's few and far between. One of the things I also want to just point out is you see a Native American woman here. Forced sterilization was rampant on Native American reservations. In the late 60s or early 70s, there was a study from the Government Accounting Office that found that more than half of all Native American women of childbearing age had been sterilized in like a 10-year period. And it was very similar to what we saw with Chicana women in LA. That women would come in for healthcare services through the IHS, the Indian Health Service. They would be told, for example, you need to have this surgery, we need to tie your tubes, this is your first baby, but don't worry, they can be untied. And increasingly, they were not being untied. And in fact, the situation comes out because there's a Native American doctor who starts seeing a lot of patients who are coming in and asking questions about whether she can untie their tubes. One woman comes to her and she said, I've heard of kidney transplants, can you give me a uterine transplant? At which point this Dr. Constant Uri says, who in the world told you this could happen? Because this young woman was like 20 years old. She was about to get married. But several years earlier, doctors had targeted her. She was poor, she was Native American. She was receiving government health insurance through the Indian Health Service. She, of course, was a problem, quote unquote, and the sterilization was the solution, but she didn't even know what had happened. So this is running rampant, and it brings this issue up of reproductive justice, that the concept of reproductive freedom is not limited just to this right to abortion or not. It gets that way because in the wake of Roe v. Wade, there's a lot of push through white middle-class feminist organizations who say we need to preserve Roe. But they preserve Roe at the expense of these other issues. Does that make sense? Can you see where I'm going with this? That they're so focused on their idea that reproductive freedom equals right to abortion that they don't understand for women who have been sterilized, that doesn't have a whole lot. For women who are looking for contraceptive freedom, there was an issue that was going on. The pill comes out in the early 1960s. By 1969, there are some problems with it. But the pill and the IUD both come out. The IUD had kind of been in existence at the turn of the 20th century, but it gave women infections. So doctors stopped prescribing it. But in the 1940s, antibiotics come on the market. And increasingly, those infections are not so deadly. So the pill comes out, IUDs are brought out, we have the rise of Planned Parenthood and many other clinics, many of them federally funded. But what was happening is increasingly women of color would go into those clinics and they'd be told, you need to have a Dawkins shield or you need to have an IUD. A white woman would come in and she'd be said, do you want the pill? The difference here is an IUD is inserted by a doctor. It can only be removed by a doctor. A pill, if you decide to stop taking the pill, you just stop taking it, right? Women control contraception. And many doctors had these racial attitudes that said that women of color couldn't be trusted, quote unquote, to effectively regulate their own reproduction. So a woman of color would go into the clinic and she'd be given an IUD. She'd have to push hard for the pill. A white woman would be told, oh, you have the pill, go ahead, no problem. Many of them, though, when there were problems with the pill, then start having to fight to try to get an IUD. So race and class are determining what types of reproductive health care are available to women, and they're also determining how women understand that definition of what it means to have reproductive rights. Most recently, I've been looking at a series of cases of forced cesarean sections. This is one of the first cases that I found. This is Aisha Maiden. This is her husband Mustafa and her sons Ihsan and Zafir. Aisha Maiden in 1986 was living in Washington, D.C. She's 19 years old. She's married. Her husband is a theater director. At the time she's about to give birth, at the end of her pregnancy, he's out of work. She's enrolled at Georgetown or George Washington, I can't remember, one of the universities. She's in summer school and her water breaks. So she goes and she calls her husband, she goes to the hospital, and the hospital that she goes to is a private pay hospital. It was the closest one, and they send her home. They say, we're sorry, you're on public assistance, we can't serve you. Wait for your labor to get going, and then we need you to go into Georgetown Hospital, which will take public pay patients. So she waits for a couple days, her labor gets going, and she goes into the hospital. June 1986. When she gets in, her labor stalls. Now, if you were to ask her husband, he would say her labor stalls because she has been strapped down to her bed. And for anyone who's been in labor, you kind of want to wiggle and walk around and get things going a bit. She was told, and this was kind of practice at the time, you stay in bed. In fact, at one point, several of her cords, she has a fetal heart rate monitor on, and they all start getting twisted, and her husband starts taking them off to untwist them, and a medical assistant comes and pushes him aside and says, if you touch her again, you're out of the hospital. They were convinced, and all he wanted to do was untangle her so she could get up and walk around. She wanted to move, she wanted to get her labor going. Her labor doesn't get going, she's stuck in bed, and a doctor comes in. She goes into the hospital at 7 in the morning. By 7 in the evening, a new resident comes in, and he says, wow, you've been at 7 centimeters for like 12 hours, and oh, by the way, your water broke 2 days before. Well, you're gonna have an infected baby. You need a C-section right now. And she says, well, with all due respect, I don't really want a C-section. I feel fine, I have no temperature, I have no signs of infection. I'd like to just get up and walk around. I said, no, we're gonna give it a couple more hours, but if you don't, you need a C-section. And she says, again, with all due respect, I'd like to just get up, I don't want to do this. She says, I'm a Muslim, and according to my religion, I should have the ability to make decisions about my body. Her husband is clearly backing her. The hospital is unhappy with this, and it goes to court. It goes to a juvenile court. It brings in a judge to the hospital for a midnight hearing. It gives an attorney for Aisha, an attorney for her fetus, which is still inside of her, right? And an attorney for the hospital. Now, the only attorney who's had a chance to prep is the attorney for the hospital because he's been sitting in there. He knows about these lawsuits. He's been talking to the doctors for several hours. The attorney who represents Maiden has never heard of such a suit. And essentially what ends up happening is the attorney talks to both of the couple, Aisha and Mustafa, for less than 30 minutes. And then everyone leaves Aisha's bedside and they have a hearing about her away from her across the hall in which the court decides that her fetus has a right to life and her fetus should be able to be born despite the fact that she is saying no. And she said, again, it wasn't like I opposed cesarean section. I just saw no reason to have one right now. If my fetus was in distress, I would say, wheel me to the operating room. But I don't think I need the surgery now. And they said, no, we're really sorry, ma'am. You're going against medical opinion, and there's a fetus involved here, and it's a full-term fetus. So we hereby give custody of your fetus to the hospital while it's inside of you. The hospital is ordering a cesarean section. When the fetus is born and it becomes a baby, baby is all yours, best of luck. So 30 minutes later, they wheel her into the hospital and she is delivered via C-section. Baby is fine, there's no indication whatsoever of any kind of damage done. When reproductive justice advocates asked her about it later, she said the experience was like being raped. She had been wheeled into an operating room. She had been held down, her whole lower body numbed. The baby had been born, her husband was not there, and it was handed to her, and that was it. Not surprisingly, when she has her second child, she goes to a midwife and gives birth at home, because she's like, I'm done with this hospital. This is not going to work for me. Her case is significant in and of itself. Her case is significant when placed in the context of the 28 other cases that I found that were predominantly against women of color. The New England Journal of Medicine conducted a study of this, and actually I have a picture of it. You can see in the woman who wrote the study. This is Dr. Veronica Colder. She finds this out because she's at University of Illinois, Chicago. And at University of Illinois Chicago Hospital, there is a woman pregnant with triplets, naturally conceived triplets. And for the last month of her pregnancy, she has been hospitalized. Increasingly, the hospital staff says to her, we would like you to have a cesarean section because you have 3 babies and this is the process. And she says, with all due respect, I don't want that. My husband and I plan to go back to Nigeria. And the rule at the time was once a cesarean, always a cesarean. And so she said, we plan to have more children, but there's no hospital that can do this kind of operation back home. So we plan to go home in about a year. I can't have a C-section now because every other child will have to be a C-section, and there's no one to do that C-section there. So as long as everything's fine, I plan to deliver at home. They decide to go and talk to an attorney behind her back. So when she goes into labor, everyone in the hospital knows that it's up to her, that everyone in the hospital knows that she's going to have a cesarean section, except for her. She says no, she says no. Her husband comes in and tries to interfere, and it takes 7 security guards to take her husband out. She is dosed with ketamine, which is an animal tranquilizer, wheeled into the operating room, kicking and screaming, operated on, and then let go. And then audaciously, if you can believe it, 3 days later, hospitals have newsletters, and they give you like the good news, things that we've done. On the cover of the hospital newsletter was her surgery. No one mentioned the fact that this was violent. That leaves her doctor, this is Veronica Colder, was a resident at the time, and it leaves her doctor to say, what is going on here? So she does a series of studies, and she sends out questionnaires to all these public hospitals because she assumes that this abuse is happening at public hospitals where there's a difference in race and class and gender between doctors and patients. And she finds that here she finds 21 cases of it. I found an additional 7. For her 21 cases, 86% happened against women of color. Of the 21 cases, 18 were successful. 24% of the women who were involved in this didn't speak English. Like not even, like English as a second language, like they didn't speak the language. And this happened to them anyway. When this comes out, it comes out 1 month before the death of Angela Carter. Angela Carter's story is what takes reproductive justice. It takes this issue of forced cesarean sections to the next level. Angela Carter in 1987 is pregnant. She's 25. She's 25 weeks pregnant. She's had cancer twice. She is 25 weeks into her pregnancy. She thinks she's in remission when they find that she has a lung tumor that has covered her entire left lung and has gone into her main stem bronchus, which is what connects the lungs up into the throat. She is literally on death's door. And this happens within a period of a week. Doctors come to the ICU and they say to her parents, her husband is so thunderstruck he literally can't speak. They say to her parents, when she dies, do you want us to do an emergency cesarean section? This is a 25-week fetus. Viability was about 28 weeks, 26, 27. What do you want us to do? And the parents say, just let her die in peace. Let her die. You don't need to slice her open. The hospital, though, says, hey, we knew about Aisha Maiden, because a year before, there was a woman who had been forced into a cesarean section. Because Aisha Maiden had had a cesarean section, we think this woman has to have a cesarean section. Carter says, no, there's an emergency hearing called. The judge rules against her and in favor of the fetus. There's a series of appeals. The appeals are happening. She's wheeled into the operating room. The cesarean section is performed. The baby dies less than 2 hours later in her father's arms. Her name is Lindsay Marie, they name her. And then 2 days later, Angela Carter dies. And you can see, I actually have a copy of her death certificate right here, and it's very fuzzy, but I thought bringing in some of the documents that historians use to talk about this would be helpful. Osteosarcoma is the cause of it, but the second thing is there are complications from a cesarean section. Carter dies 2 days after her surgery. This is what then sparks a movement to talk about whether or not doctors have the ability to override women's decision-making during labor. What I want to do to conclude is make the point that the one woman here who is a white woman, Angela Carter, and I give you a picture of her because I think it's important to see their faces, her story becomes the story of forced cesarean sections. Now, her parents challenged the lawsuit, and in 1990 they win, so the decision that says a doctor and a hospital can override a woman's decision and force her into a cesarean section, that's nullified. But it means that this whole larger story, Aisha Maiden, the Nigerian woman who still literally has no name, I've never found a name for her, that those stories get lost. And so part of the process of reproductive justice in the academy is not just advocating for the rights of all women, but also advocating to have the stories of those women who have either been abused or victimized or advocated on behalf of them, whether or not they were a victim of it or not, is to bring their voices to the fore so they stand alongside the other feminist leaders. And it becomes a more inclusive story. I'm going to end there.
So thank you for the introduction, Hong, and thank you for inviting me as well, and to Anastasia and everyone who put this on. I really appreciate it. So Rebecca's talk was a great introduction to what I'm about to talk about. So I'm going to talk more about contemporary issues. I think a few things that her talk introduced really well and helpfully, first of all, reproductive justice. So keep in mind that framework of reproductive justice that she was just talking about as I talk. One of the things I'm focused on in my research in general, and in particular what I'm going to talk about today, is the intersection between medical and legal expertise. So think back to those examples that Dr. Kluchin just gave you about forced cesarean sections, forced sterilization. Those happen more or less with the authority and backing of medical experts and legal experts. Okay, so remember the Madrigal case that she introduced, right? Women were forcibly sterilized without their consent. The law was sort of like, that's okay. Oh, sorry, my thing, does my thing not work? Okay, so is that better? So there's this intersection between legal and medical expertise that often authorizes and allows for reproductive abuses that reproductive justice advocates are organizing against, advocating against, and a lot of times sort of making substantial changes about. One thing that I want to, so I'm going to talk today about a particular technology, and I want to first introduce, this alliance between legal and medical experts isn't straightforward or easy. They're not always in agreement. Sometimes there's tension between how they're thinking. The technology I'm going to focus on is the technology of ultrasound. So it is a pervasive technology. I'm sure you've all seen images like this. Right? It's sort of a commonplace. We take it for granted that it reveals something true about what's happening inside one's body, right? In particular, what's happening in pregnancy. Feminist scholars have critiqued ultrasound and how ultrasound gets represented publicly and by medical and legal experts to say it does more than just sort of represent some objective truth. It actually helps us form a certain idea of what pregnancy is about and what a fetus, the sort of meaning of a fetus. So again, think back to those examples of forced cesarean sections. Before the advent of ultrasound as a prenatal technology, we didn't have the same sort of public understandings of a fetus as sort of fully formed and presented separate from a pregnant woman's body. Right? There was more of a relational understanding. It's only once the fetus gets presented as separate that you can even imagine the kind of conflict that led to the forced C-section. Right? a fetus has to be understood as having separate rights, separate personhood, for it to make sense to intervene in this most intimate relationship. So, and that's not to say that there's not some utility in ultrasounds, but that the way that they get publicly understood is really worth examining. Okay? So what I've been doing recently is looking at the sort of some medical representations and explanations of fetal ultrasound alongside legal efforts to regulate ultrasound. Okay? So I'm going to give you another slide that sort of represents one of the ways that a lot of scholars have sort of explained how the medical field tends to understand fetuses. And it's related to this technology, because without this technology, we can't see inside in the same way. So these are 3 pictures from the annual conference pamphlets from an organization called the International Fetal Medicine and Surgery Society. So, and I chose them because they sort of embody, I think, a particular way of understanding fetuses that is common in the medical profession. So on the far left, you have sort of a male doctor, right, sort of probing inside. You see the fully formed fetus in there, right, setting himself as the expert, really looking and sort of seeking the truth from an outside perspective, right? That's how you understand what's really happening in pregnancy or to the fetus, is by sort of probing very literally inside a woman's body. The next is the fetus is actually represented as a doctor, as a surgeon with a mask, which is really just kind of a bizarre. But so not only is the fetus sort of separated, though there's an umbilical cord there, so a suggestion of some connection to someone else's body, but very good motor skills. And then the last one is very interesting and strange. So this was for a conference in Hawaii. The fetus is represented as surfing on its own placenta. And there's just something, this is just such a bizarre image, right? So again, fully formed person, can exist on its own, right? And even surf on its own. Very good. So this represents a particular way that the medical profession has tended to understand fetuses and pregnancy more generally, right? That what they're doing, they have sort of a separate patient that they're taking care of, and that patient is autonomous in a sense, independent, right? Ignoring the fact that they're intimately connected to a pregnant woman. Okay, so when it comes to regulations of ultrasound, remember, part of my interest is not just in what the medical profession does, but how it gets taken up in law. So there are 2 important trends right now when it comes to regulations over ultrasound. One slide is so-called pre-abortion ultrasound mandates. So about 14 states have some version of these laws, require a woman to undergo an ultrasound before she has an abortion. So there's an organization called Americans United for Life that is very influential when it comes to this kind of legislation. This is from one of their guides. So they put out these model guides for legislators just to sort of adopt. And here's what they say about ultrasound. Ultrasound requirements ensure informed choice because they allow a woman to see her unborn child as he or she really is by seeing his or her form and face on a screen, and also by hearing the heartbeat. These provisions promote the woman's physical and psychological health and advance the state's important and legitimate interest in protecting life. So one thing I want you to know, everybody knows a couple of things. So one, they are taking up that idea, right, that ultrasound represents fetus as it truly is. And secondly, that ultrasound is important not just because it allows a doctor to diagnose maybe something that's going on in the pregnancy, but also because a woman can see the ultrasound and bond with her fetus. And this is important medically, right, for her psychological and health, and also for maybe changes in behavior that she is going to undertake after she realizes sort of the true personhood of the fetus she's carrying. Okay. There's another context of ultrasound regulations, And this is what's called keepsake fetal ultrasound. So there are all of these businesses across the country that sell ultrasound keepsakes. So they say, they have to, in some jurisdictions, say that they're not for medical purposes. Though they often use this sort of similar language of, you will bond with your fetus and it will be good for your health, and they kind of suggest it's medical even though they're not doctors and they're not part of the medical profession, right? So this is like if you can go to these places and get everything from a video of a fetus moving to you can get a heartbeat put in a stuffed animal, and all sorts of services. Some of them are offered in sort of spa-like places where you can also get a massage. And then you get all these things to take home and show to your family, your support network, to sort of begin the process of bringing the fetus into a social existence. Okay? When it comes to these, though, the regulations are a little all over the place. The FDA has said they recommend against the use of keepsake ultrasounds. They say the long-term effects of tissue heating and cavitation are not known. Therefore, ultrasound scans should be done only when there's medical need, based on a prescription and performed by appropriately trained operators. Fetal keepsake videos are controversial because there's no medical benefit gained from exposing the fetus to ultrasound. So notice these two different ways of framing this bonding potential or the medical benefit of ultrasounds that are not specifically called for by a doctor. On the one hand, the Americans United for Life says this is important medically, bonding is really important psychologically and to health and all these things. The FDA recommendations and all major medical organizations support the FDA recommendations, partially because they want to keep the fetal imaging monopoly, right? So they don't want anyone else to be able to do it without a medical license. But notice that they're claiming it's sort of not so medical, right? There's no good reason to do this, right? So we should not allow these keepsake ultrasound facilities to exist. Nonetheless, for the most part, enforcement of regulations and regulations over these are at the state level. Most states really don't do a whole lot, if anything at all, so there's a proliferation of these services despite these FDA recommendations and the recommendations of a lot of medical professions. So with that background in mind, what I did is I looked at, the questions in my mind, like, is there actually medical research on whether ultrasound helps a woman bond to her fetus? Right? The AUL model legislation cites what looks like a medical study, saying, yes, this does promote bonding, suggesting there's a really important sort of medical component. So I looked, and there is literature on this. So there's a segment of the medical profession that has sort of tried to study whether or not seeing an ultrasound can help a woman bond to her fetus earlier or better in pregnancy, with the heavy suggestion that that would have important health outcomes. Okay? So in looking at this literature, I was sort of, I examine everything sort of critically, or I think that the study of medicine is too important to just leave to doctors. It's like, what are they assuming in these studies, right? How are they framing the importance of a bond? How do you measure the bond? So I discovered a few things. And before I get to that, though, I want to introduce the idea of good mothering. Right? You might have, I asked you, like, so what does a good mother do? We might have a bunch of different ideas, but there is certainly like a common way of thinking about what a good mother does. Okay? And I like this quote from Evelyn Nakano-Glenn. She sort of talks about how the discourse or ideology of good mothering operates. She says, for most of the 20th century, an idealized model of motherhood derived from the situation of the white American middle class has been projected as universal. In this model, responsibility for mothering rests almost exclusively on one woman, the biological mother, for whom it constitutes the primary, if not sole mission during the child's formative years. Okay? So So it's a particular idea of motherhood in which there's one woman who is sort of intensively invested in her children, right? So it's not a communal understanding of child raising, and in which, but sort of the best mother, the ideal mother, is intensively invested in raising the child, and that's sort of what's best from a mothering perspective, because it's what's best for children. Okay, so Bell Hooks comments on this idea. She says, the idea of an individual having sole responsibility for child rearing is the most unusual pattern of parenting in the world, one that has proved to be unsuccessful because it isolates children and parents from society. Right? So there are other ways to think about parenting, right? That it's a communal exercise or a social exercise, that we should socially support parents and not just put sole responsibility on one woman for raising children. So this is, in some ways, what I found when I looked at the medical literature on maternal-fetal bonding. I think replicates and reinforces this ideal of what good mothering is like, right? So a few things that I found. One is that the studies on whether ultrasound promotes bonding first rely on the existence of a way to measure bonding. And the way to measure bonding, it turns out just to be self-assessment questionnaires, right? So we'll just get a questionnaire about like how she feels toward the fetus. And there's a lot of issues with this. One is they have within them certain sort of values that are being encoded, right? So if you know what you're supposed to say, are you really going to be honest, right? Like, yes, I think obsessively about my fetus because that's what I'm supposed to be doing, right? That's what the culture is telling me to do, right? So they're value-laden categories to begin with. And they also accept that it's just transparent what we think and feel, right? I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm confused about how I feel about things. So they rely on self-assessment. They also privilege this exact idea. So being very focused on the fetus, right? Not seeing it as just part of your existence that doesn't necessitate a huge amount of change or that something that's going to work into your existing fabric of your life. The questionnaires presume that thinking of sort of almost obsessively about the fetus is what's best, right? So you should be really preoccupied, not just something I'm doing, and not to say pregnancy, yeah, it's a big deal, but there are different ways to conceptualize it. It also presumes that thinking of the fetus as a fully formed person is best. Okay, so go back to those images, right? Again, there are different ways of thinking about it. It's a developing person, it's part of a existing social relationships, or really these questionnaires tend to suggest that the best way to think of the fetus is fully formed, separate individual, right? Which is a contested way of thinking, right? So they're building in these values into these questionnaires. Then these questionnaires get used to study whether or not ultrasound affects maternal-fetal bonding. The studies on their own terms are inconclusive, right? But my goal is not really even to show what they say, but to sort of uncover what they're assuming about what pregnancy should look like and what mothering should look like. So I found that these studies see maternal-fetal attachment as natural, this kind of bonding process as natural, rather than something that's allowed by the technology in the first place. And there's kind of this tension, because they see it as natural, but then they also see the technology as really important to jump-starting this natural process, right? And the technology, though, is this clear intervention from outside. So there's this kind of circularity there, I'd say. They also see this ultrasound as really helpful in changing women's behavior. Like, the women will take their pregnancy more seriously, they will adhere to health recommendations and all of this stuff if they're given an ultrasound. So I think there are a lot of interesting things we could say about this body of work. One is that this technical imagery of the ultrasound is used to change emotions, okay? So it's not, and there's sort of this imperative to to change your emotions, right? That whatever you're feeling, if you're feeling ambivalent about your pregnancy, or if you're worried, right, you're preoccupied with other things because you don't have good medical care, you don't have good social support, maybe you're in an area with a lot of environmental toxins and that's stressing you out. Those are things that we're not going to address those. Instead, the best way to solve the problem is to focus on changing an individual woman's emotion. Okay? So there's a way in which what this literature does is it focuses on the individual as the central thing to address when it comes to pregnancy problems or issues that we could see from a more systematic frame. Okay? So again, if we think back to this concept of reproductive justice, right? There are so many issues that affect reproductive justice, right? From mass incarceration to environmental toxins to lack of health care to lack of social support, that is not being addressed, right? And you could say, well, that's just not what the medical profession does. But I think what they're doing is they're perpetuating the idea that the best way to deal with any sort of issue in pregnancy is to change an individual's emotions through technology. Right? Taking away a focus on these larger systemic issues that are much more important for reproductive justice, right? And also taking away the ability to be ambivalent about pregnancy, right? That is something that marks you as a bad mother before you even give birth. So I think, in other words, there's a lot at stake here. And so my future research is sort of looking at this tension between certain aspects of medical expertise and how legal expertise relates to or takes up that medical expertise. And there's a lot of tension in some places, less tension in others. I'd be happy to talk in the Q&A about other issues of technology and law and reproductive justice, but this is one area where I think it's interesting, is where my current research is focusing, so that's why I talked about it. So thank you.